Well, hi there, I'm Matt, one of the Maybridge staff, and as always, let me extend a huge welcome to anyone joining in today who's not connected to our church, just as much as to everybody who is. Hope you're having a really good week. I recently heard this really interesting little story. In 1952, a young woman called Florence Chadwick jumped into the Pacific Ocean off a place called Catalina Island, and the plan was to swim to mainland California. It was quite a long way. She was already the first woman to swim the English Channel both ways. Very impressive. And on this occasion, it was a cold and foggy day. And after she'd been swimming for hours and hours, of course, she was totally exhausted. And she asked for people on a support boat to pull her in, pull her back into the boat. One of those people was her mother, who shouted, keep going, keep going. But she stopped swimming, and so they pulled her out. And it was only then, on the boat, she could see the shore was less than half a mile away. And at the press conference the next day, she said, all I could see was the fog. I think if I could have seen the shore, I would have made it. She just needed to know how tangibly close her destination was, and it would have changed everything. Now, we've been talking about heaven these last few weeks as a church because even in the most uncertain of times, like now, getting a glimpse of the shore ahead is what we need to stay joyful and motivated and keep going. Seeing what's ahead changes how we approach everything right now. Today's the fourth and final part. Part one, we talked about the place of heaven, how heaven is not some mythical place out there in the cosmos, but one day where God is and where we are will become the same place. The Bible uses this phrase, new heaven and earth. That's what's coming. Part two, we talked about the people of heaven and how God's people will be given a new body, new character, and a new community. Absolutely incredible. And then part three was all about what you could maybe call the purposes of heaven, how we will work hard and yet we'll find rest and we'll find joy in both as a form of worship that is more and more than just sat on clouds and singing songs forever and ever. So that's the place, the people, and the purpose. Today is all about the God of heaven. You thought I was going to come up with something beginning with P, didn't you? Well, not this time. No, today rounds off the series with a little bit about the God of heaven. All that other stuff we've talked about is really important, it's worth thinking about, it's fun to think about, but God is the main event. He's the culmination. Now, of course, we're a church, so obviously we talk about God all the time. But today, we're particularly thinking about encountering God in this new heaven and earth and what our relationship with him will be like. And I've broken this up into three thoughts. Wanting God, meeting God, getting God. And so firstly, wanting God. And let me ask you something, which this might sound like quite a weird question. Do you want God? Do you want God? Now, if you'd call yourself a Christian, your instinctive answer is probably to say, well, yeah, of course I do. I'm a Christian. I want God. But hold on a second. Even the most ardently committed Christian struggles with things about God. Let's be honest about it. He's not like us. He sees things differently. He loves people that we don't like. He doesn't always explain to us why certain things happen that we really didn't want to happen. He takes moral positions on things that are unpopular in the eyes of every single culture in the world. Different things, but every culture has problems with how God sees things. When it really comes to it, do you want God? Do you want to be close to the God who made the universe? It has to be on his terms. You and I don't get to define the relationship. Do you really want to let go of your own point of view and your pride and your perspective in order to get close to him? If you're not someone who calls himself a Christian, you might have a different angle. You might think about it more philosophically. You might think, well, if God is there, I can't deny it'd be interesting to see what he's like. How could a person not be at least curious about that sort of thing? It'd be fascinating. The thing is, if the God of Christianity is real, he's personal. He's not an object you can push and prod and stick and look at under a magnifying glass. He's personal and epic, and his very presence demands acknowledgement and worship. So the question of whether we even want God is a big one. When we describe the new heaven and earth, as we have in the past few weeks, it sounds wonderful, but God is at the heart of it, and he's the point of it. Describing heaven without God in the centre is like describing living in my family home without my wife. I mean, it's a great house. I'm in it right now. We love our house. It's brilliant. But without my wife, it's not the same. She is obviously far more important to me than the building that surrounds us, as nice as the building happens to be. This whole thing of whether we actually want God is complicated because, let's face it, humans are fickle creatures even at the best of times. Look at a couple of things that Jesus says about this in John's Gospel, an eyewitness account of his life. In John 3, Jesus says, God sent his Son into the world, not to judge the world, but to save the world through him. There is no judgment against anyone who believes in him, but anyone who does not believe in him has already been judged for not believing in God's one and only Son. And the judgment is based on this fact. God's light came into the world, but people loved the darkness more than the light. Now that passage seems really black and white. It sounds like it's up to us. We need to choose God or we're in trouble. And certainly there are people who, Jesus says, love darkness more than light. In other words, they just didn't want God. But just a few chapters later in John chapter 6, in the same book, Jesus says this, For no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws them to me, and at the last day I'll raise them up. As it is written in the Scriptures, they will all be taught by God. Everyone who listens to the Father and learns from him comes to me. So, are the people who choose to follow God those who just make a certain decision at some point in their life, or is it entirely the work of God that compels them to make that decision in the first place? This is a very complicated thing. Very clever scholars have debated this for centuries over and over. Whatever the exact answer, it's complicated and it's certainly somewhat a mystery to us. And I suspect that sometimes we need the reassurance that God is in control and our changeable feelings are not decisive, and other times we need the kick up the backside to get out of our complacent laziness and choose to follow God in our lives. And so you get both of these sort of angles coming out in the Bible, and even within one book, as we just saw. Jesus, though, more than anyone else in the Bible, underlines that there are two choices, and therefore there are ultimately two destinations. One of them is heaven, or the new heaven, as we're talking about through this series, and of course the other is hell. Now, in our culture, a lot of people are offended by the idea of hell, and of course we're delighted by the idea of heaven. But a lot of that is about the imagery and the ideas we associate with them. Think about it like this. If I stopped 100 people in the street and said to them, would you like to go to heaven or hell? 100 of them would say heaven, right? Of course they would. But if I'd asked a different question, it might be a bit more split. If I said to 100 people, when it comes down to it, do you want to spend eternity close to God, who you can't control or contain, or away from God, which of those would you prefer? I don't think it would be 100 either way. Many of us, myself included, would like to believe that the new heaven and earth is the automatic destination for all people. But that's not how Jesus seems to describe it. And actually, God invests people with a dignity of greater choice and leeway than that. Now, of course, lots of people never hear about Jesus. Lots of people cannot make that choice about him because they don't have the ability in some way. That's something that's in God's hands. But there are also plenty of people who know enough about God, but they just don't want him. They just don't want him in their lives. And that's what hell is. That's what hell's about. The author and Oxford scholar C.S. Lewis once said this: the gates of hell are locked from the inside. From the inside. Hell is not just a place, it's an everlasting ruin, a decay, a crumbling, a retreating into yourself, a loss of all rationality and joy, a plunging into misery. But it's a self-plunging. And God somehow, on some level, allows people to go. Hell is not about fire and pitchforks. It's the absence of God and everything that God stands for. It's the continuing loss of personhood and relationship. It's the ultimate dehumanizer. And we need to mention hell in this series because it shows us what Jesus saves people from. You see, here's the thing. It's where everybody would deservedly and appropriately end up without him. Left to our own devices, all of us, and I choose my words carefully here, all of us on some level crave hell. Now, we'd never say it like that, but what we want is to be in charge of our own lives, proud, independent, and unwilling to change. We by nature need saving from ourselves and our own desires. Jesus gladly offers himself in our place. On the cross, he experiences the hell of being separated from God. It's not just physical pain, it's separation and loneliness and distancing from all that's good. Even knowing that, We still need God somehow mysteriously to draw us to himself and somehow gift us with faith in him and trust in him. We can't even get our desires straight without help. And yet at the same time, somehow we're culpable for our own choices. It's complicated. But the key thing I think is this: God does not want a single person to be separated from him. Jesus died for each of us individually. God is willing to allow people to go to hell, but I am absolutely certain that is not his desire. He's looking to rescue people, not leave them. And I suspect there'll be far more people in the new heaven and earth than we're expecting. We're going to be astonished by some of the people that made it. Second thought, and a much more joyful one: meeting God. One day those who want God will meet him. Even a cursory thought about this is mind-blowing. What will it be like? A really, really long time ago, early in the Old Testament story, God was working with the people of Israel, although they weren't yet called the people of Israel, they were called the Hebrews, and they were led by a bloke called Moses. You may have heard of him. And Moses and God had a great relationship. God trusts Moses with lots of responsibility, and he reveals things to him before he does to anybody else. In the book of Exodus, chapter 33, Moses is leading the people through the desert, and God tells him to lead them into the land that we now know as Israel. And Moses is quite apprehensive about this. Here's how the conversation goes. Exodus 33. Then Moses said, "If you don't personally go with us, don't make us leave this place. How will anyone know that you look favourably on me and on your people, if you don't go with us? For your presence among us sets your people and me apart from all other people on the earth." The Lord replied to Moses, "I will indeed do what you've asked, for I look favourably on you, and I know you by name." Moses responded, "Then show me your glorious presence." The Lord replied, "I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will call out my name, Yahweh, before you. I will show mercy to anyone I choose, and I will show compassion to anyone I choose. But you may not look directly at my face, for no one may see me and live." The Lord continued, "Look, stand near me on this rock. As my glorious presence passes by, I'll hide you in the crevice of the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand and let you see me from behind, but my face will not be seen." Very strange passage. Moses is about to do something very challenging. He wants to know that God's with him. That's his problem. He says, "Show me your glorious presence. I need to know that you're here." And what happens next is this really odd, unprecedented thing. And I have to say, it's not like this happens every 5 minutes in the Old Testament. It really doesn't. But let's remember the context is to reassure Moses. And to do that, God demonstrates something of his glory. The Hebrew word for glory literally means weight. Something of God's heaviness, his worth. But it's too much. It's too heavy. And God says to Moses, "Look, you hide over here in the rock, and I'll come past and you can look at my back." Now, I'm sure this isn't because God is less glorious from behind. It's not like he's saying, "Yeah, that's my worst side, Moses. You'll be able to cope with that." This is God lowering himself to a way that Moses is capable of understanding and saying to him, "Moses, I'm too much for you to face square on. You'd literally die on the spot. I'm too glorious. The physical way I'm going to show you this will demonstrate I'm so powerful, so glorious, that you have nothing to worry about when you lead the people forward as I've asked you to do." And that's the point of the story, but it also points to a bigger reality, the distance between man and God. Now, in our culture, we can be very complacent about God. We use his name to swear. We ask philosophical questions about whether he even exists. But the biblical picture really makes you stand up and take notice. God is so great, so glorious, so awesome. You can't even make eye contact with him. You can't face him. You wouldn't be able to deal with it. The greatest leader in the Old Testament gets to look at God from behind once. How can anybody else possibly even get close? This is why what Jesus does is so amazing. Jesus is God become a man, showing up in a way that we can interact, that we can relate. Elsewhere in John's Gospel, chapter 14, Jesus is having a chat with one of his followers, a bloke called Philip, and they have this stunning conversation. Philip is trying to work Jesus out. He's trying to work out what he's up to. And then Jesus says this, "If you really know me, you'll know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him." Philip said, "Lord, show us the Father, and that'll be enough for us." Jesus answered, "Don't you know me, Philip, even after I've been among you such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. how can you say, show us the Father? So Jesus says this show-stopping thing. He says, Philip, you know God the Father, the one who created the cosmos, and Moses couldn't even look him in the face, and he's the judge of all things. Well, yeah, if you've seen me, you've seen him. And Philip misses the magnitude of it. He wants reassurance, like, Jesus, life's hard, show us God, we'll be fine, that's all that we need. And Jesus says, no, don't you realise? It's me. If you've seen me, you've seen him. That is how inseparable we are. So Jesus he's the bridge, he's the gap filler. And of course, it's not only that he comes into our world and makes God relatable in a new way. It's also that on the cross, he deals with the very sin of humanity that means that meeting God face to face is too much. Too much for Moses, too much for anybody who hasn't been made clean by what Jesus does. On the day that I die, I will come face to face with God. I'll be blown away. He'll be unimaginably glorious. But because Jesus has dealt with my sin, I'll be able to stand in front of him. I'll be able to face God as if I'm perfect, even though I'm not right now, of course, because Jesus has subbed in for me. And it's this amazing thing. He comes into our world. That's God lowering himself to us. But what he does in death and resurrection, it means that in some amazing, mysterious way, we get raised up with him and we can bear to be in the presence of God. It's the only way it could happen. And so one day, on the new heaven and earth, God's people will come face to face with our Creator. It will begin in a moment, but it will last forever. As we said last week, it won't just be singing hymns eternally when we meet God. This is the third thought, by the way. Although there will certainly be music and acts of worship, we will have total access to God in every moment. We'll be able to be close to him. Now, we've looked a few times in this series at the strange New Testament book of Revelation, a vision given to John, the same one who wrote John's Gospel. And it's full of imagery. It needs to be unpicked very carefully. But early on in chapter 1, before the really, really, really strange stuff gets going on, John has a very simply has a vision of Jesus. Incredible, powerful vision. Now you have to remember, John was one of the closest disciples of Jesus. He spent every day with him for years. He knows him really well. He's like his best mate. But when John has this vision and this image of meeting Jesus, he says this: "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, 'Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever.'" John is so staggered, so in awe, he falls down as if dead. And I think this is how it will be for all of us in that moment. But look at what Jesus does immediately. He places his right hand on John. He communicates reassurance. "You're okay, John." He says, "Don't be afraid. There's nothing to fear, my friend." And then Jesus says, "Why? I'm the first and the last. I'm the living one. I was dead, I'm alive." Yet more reassurance. "John, I'm the eternal God who is up there. And I'm also the one who came down here and died and rose again. You saw it, remember? You can trust me. You can be with me." As the 18th century preacher Charles Spurgeon said, "You will never be more alive than when you are dead at his feet." You'll never be more alive than when you're dead at his feet. So getting God is what heaven is about. God's people will meet him and we get him for eternity. It's interesting. Here are 3 places in the Bible, different authors, each separated by hundreds of years, where the message about what God is building towards is abundantly clear. Firstly, from Leviticus, God says, "I'll put my dwelling place among you, and I will not abhor you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you'll be my people." Later on in the Bible, in Ezekiel, it says, "My dwelling place will be with them. I will be their God, and they'll be my people." Later again, in 2 Corinthians in the New Testament, "I will live with them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people." The idea throughout the Bible is the day is coming when God will live and walk among us. At the most basic level, this means he will somehow be present in a way far more tangible than he is now. It means, think about this, it means we will always have God's ear. We will always be able to speak to him and to hear him speak to us. I don't know if you've ever played that little game that people do where you have to pick 3 dinner guests for sort of the ultimate dinner party. And of course, people usually choose famous actors or great thinkers and philosophers, sports people, maybe even really bad people in history who've just done something interesting and had an interesting life. And the great news is, in God's dinner party, he would always choose you. He wouldn't limit it down to 3, of course, but he would always choose to be in the company of you. Not only will we enjoy him forever, he will enjoy all of us forever too. And this is incredible. You might be somebody who in this life feels misunderstood or particularly lonely. Maybe you're feeling that at the moment. Maybe you're somebody who you just always feel like you don't fit in, like there's a group over there and you're just not one of those people. Probably all of us have had feelings like that at some point in life. Maybe we even feel like that regularly. But when God dwells with his people, nobody is going to feel that way. God deeply wants your company. He's interested in your perspective. He's delighted to hear your thoughts. He appreciates your strange sense of humour, even when nobody else gets it. And it will always be that way. And this is why the Christian hope of heaven is so wonderful, so unique. The way heaven is understood by other faiths, other points of view, is not like this. Other views of heaven are very much, from what I've read around, what I've understood, very focused on the material benefits. They're about the stuff. They're ultimately about you. And all that does is create a vision of heaven that is simply a greater realization of what's already wrong with this world. In this world, the big problem really is that we put created stuff ahead of creator. We look for meaning and purpose and safety in every possible thing that we can ahead of God. Possessions, power, respect, etc., etc. We go out looking for everything that we possibly can, and it demonstrably doesn't work. Why would the fulfillment of the new heaven and earth be that? Sure, all the good things that there are will be in heaven. We've explored that in previous weeks, but they're not the main point. And whilst we often don't choose God and often we don't want God, underneath our trivial and temporary or misguided desires, actually, he is precisely the thing that we're after. Our deepest longings aren't really for things, but for the greatest relationship there is. And specifically, the relationship with the one person who can fulfill all the things that we want and need in a way that all of our other relationships simply cannot. The excellently named theologian Sam Storm says, "We will be constantly more amazed with God, more in love with God, and thus ever more relishing his presence and our relationship with him. Our experience of God will never reach its consummation. We will never finally arrive, as if upon reaching a peak we discover that there is nothing beyond. Our experience of God will never become stale. It will deepen and develop, intensify and amplify, broaden and balloon." For the people of God, this is what's coming, and it's absolutely wonderful. The great poet John Donne puts it a little bit more lyrically. He writes it like this: "I shall rise from the dead. I shall see the Son of God, the Son of glory, and shine myself as that sun shines. I shall be united to the Ancient of Days, to God himself, who had no morning, never began. No man ever saw God and lived, and yet I shall not live until I see God. And when I have seen him, I shall never die." So today we've talked about wanting God, getting God, meeting God. This series about the new heaven and earth, we've looked at the place, the people, the purposes of heaven. Today has been about really the main thing about heaven, God himself. And we've also said all along that what we know about heaven from the Bible is supposed to give us reassurance and joy. It's supposed to spill into today, which is especially pertinent at a time when things are quite hard for people like now. And I want to finish this little series with a bit of a challenge and a summary. And the challenge is, it's a bit different depending on who you are and where you're at with God. So firstly, if you're not a follower of Jesus, it's really simple. You need to be. You need to be. Now, some people would try to encourage others to follow Jesus as a sort of hell avoidance strategy. But the thing is, when you do that, it makes it sound like following Jesus is like taking some sort of bitter medicine that you take it to avoid getting sick down the line, but the medicine actually itself is not very nice. That's not very helpful. Think of it more like this. Jesus is this brilliant person. He's God made in the flesh. Look at his life. Why wouldn't you want to know him? He wants to know you. He's standing at your door and knocking, so to speak. You were made for relationship with him. He's the centre of all the things that you actually want out of life. And even if right now you have great satisfaction in lots of other things and you're perfectly happy, guess what? He's even better than the things you're satisfied by because he's the source of everything that's good. Without God, there is no shore in the distance like that story we had at the beginning. There's ultimately just you, just swimming on your own. But it doesn't have to be that way. If you've been listening today and you've engaged in any of the stuff that we do as a church and you're intrigued by all this, you're not sure but you're intrigued, I'd love to hear from you even if we haven't met personally. Do get in touch through our church website, or maybe if you don't want to talk to me, talk to a friend who is a Christian and ask them really hard, annoying questions. Ask them what practical difference all this God stuff makes. It's not just pie in the sky, but it's about here and now. Secondly, if you are a follower of Jesus, my hope is if you've taken anything from this series, it's how good you have it. Not because you earned it, of course, but you will one day come face to face with your Creator and live eternally in great joy and satisfaction alongside him because of what Jesus did. How could it be better than that? How could you have it better than that? When Jesus talks about heaven in the Gospels, it's not some sort of nirvana in the distant future. It's something he's already working on now. God's people are meant to be building towards what will be realised fully in the new heaven and earth. And that's why we seek to be more like Jesus now, why we follow him now. We're not just waiting until the end. It's also why we do stuff now that is looking to serve our community and beyond as a church. Like many churches, we do stuff that's not just the local community, but we look to do stuff that benefits the whole world. And that's really important. A number of us in church leadership right now are having conversations about how the future might look. And of course, there's loads of unknowns, not least because of the coronavirus. We don't know what's going to happen. And then obviously there are loads of different things that we could do that are good. But the big question always is, how do we best bring the ways of heaven into the world we live in now? So please pray for us, and please approach anyone in leadership, anyone across the church, if you have any thoughts about this and how we might move forward. On a personal level, I wonder how all this talk of heaven affects you. Maybe you're excited, it just sounds great. Maybe you're convicted that you need to live a little bit differently in light of it. Maybe you're deeply reassured and it takes away some anxiety. Maybe you're just overwhelmed with gratitude. Isn't God good to you? And when we engage with things about God and what he does, we will all respond differently. That's okay. But whatever your emotional reaction, your instinctive reaction, let's as a church cling on to this truth. The new heaven and earth is coming. We as God's people are already part of it. And life now is supposed to be lived differently because it's coming. For us, the shore is in sight. It's not too far to swim. Let's pray. Father God, as we finish this series, we thank you that Jesus has secured a place in heaven for every one of your people. There is a room waiting for us. And for those who are suffering because home right now is difficult, Lord, we thank you that heaven is a place of safety. Father, for those who are depressed, struggling with mental health issues right now, we thank you that heaven is a place of peace where the torment is no more. Lord, for those who are sad and downbeaten, we thank you that heaven is a place of continuous, unbridled joy. For those who are burdened by injustice in this world, we thank you that heaven is a place where truth and justice will reign. Lord, for those who fear change, we thank you that heaven will be a place of familiarity and home like we have never found anywhere else. For those who fear boredom, we thank you that heaven is a place of never-ending interest and fun and fascination. Father, for those who are perfectly content with life right now, we thank you that heaven is a place that will blow away our low standards. And we thank you that although we often don't choose you, you always choose us. You always want us. You always want to be in relationship with us. We, your people, cannot wait to meet you face to face on that great day. Thank you that through Jesus, that's not just possible, but for your people, it is exactly what's coming.